The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound as Elena Rodriguez adjusted her medical bag for the third time. At 28, she had already spent 6 years serving as a combat medic, but something about this deployment felt different. The remote forward operating base in the mountainous region near the Pakistan border seemed more isolated than any place she had served before. Elena wasn't the type of person who drew attention to herself. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with dark hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, she moved through the base with quiet efficiency. Her fellow soldiers knew her as the medic who never panicked, never complained, and somehow always had exactly what was needed when someone got hurt. What they didn't know was that Elena had grown up in East Los Angeles, where survival meant learning to read situations quickly and react even faster. Her father had been a police officer, her mother a nurse. Both had taught her that helping people sometimes meant making hard choices. When Elena enlisted in the army after finishing her nursing degree, her parents weren't surprised. They had watched their daughter practice emergency medicine on injured animals she found in their neighborhood, seen her study combat tactics with the same dedication she applied to anatomy textbooks. The base commander, Colonel Martinez, had initially been skeptical about having a female medic assigned to such a remote location. The intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity in the area, and he worried about putting any of his soldiers at additional risk. But Elena's service record spoke for itself. 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars for valor, and a reputation for keeping soldiers alive under impossible circumstances. What made Elena different from other medics wasn't just her medical training. During her second deployment, she had witnessed a field hospital being overrun by enemy forces. The memory of watching helpless medical personnel being killed while trying to tend to wounded soldiers had changed something fundamental in her approach to combat medicine. She began studying military tactics, weapons training, and combat strategy with the same intensity she had once reserved for medical texts. Her commanding officers noticed Elena's additional training but saw it as the healthy paranoia of someone who had seen too much combat. They encouraged her pursuit of advanced combat certifications, thinking it would make her a more effective medic. None of them realized that Elena was preparing for a scenario that most military medical personnel hoped they would never face. The base where Elena was now stationed served as both a medical facility and a strategic observation post. Located in a valley surrounded by rocky hills, it provided crucial intelligence about enemy movements while offering medical support to patrol units operating in the region. The medical facility could handle everything from routine injuries to complex surgeries, making it an essential resource for operations throughout the area. Elena had been at the base for 2 months when she first noticed the patterns in local civilian behavior. As someone who had grown up reading the subtle signs of neighborhood tensions, she recognized when people were preparing for trouble. Vendors who usually came to the base stopped showing up. Children who normally played near the outer perimeter disappeared. The few local workers still coming to the base seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact and finishing their tasks quickly. She mentioned her observations to the intelligence officer, Lieutenant Chen, who filed her report but seemed more focused on electronic surveillance data than human intelligence. Elena understood the military's reliance on technology, but her street-smart instincts told her that something significant was being overlooked. The medical team at the base consisted of Elena, 2 other medics, a physician assistant, and a surgeon who rotated between several forward bases. Elena had quickly established herself as the practical leader of the medical unit, not through rank or authority, but through competence and reliability. When medical supplies ran low, she found creative solutions. When wounded soldiers arrived in the middle of the night, she was always the first person ready to receive them. Dr. Sarah Brennan, the physician assistant, had initially been concerned about Elena's additional combat training. During their first week working together, she had discovered Elena's collection of weapons manuals and tactical studies mixed in with her medical journals. When she asked about it, Elena had simply said that a medic needed to be prepared for anything. Dr. Brennan had accepted the explanation, but she noticed that Elena approached military medicine differently than most medics she had worked with. While other medics focused primarily on treating wounded soldiers and getting them evacuated to larger facilities, Elena seemed constantly aware of the tactical situation around the medical facility. She knew the guard rotations, understood the base's defensive positions, and had memorized the locations of all weapons and ammunition storage areas. Most importantly, she had quietly established relationships with every soldier on the base, learning not just their medical histories but their combat specialties and psychological profiles. Elena's most significant relationship at the base was with Sergeant First Class Marcus Williams, a career infantry soldier who served as the base's senior non-commissioned officer. Williams had initially been puzzled by Elena's interest in combat tactics, but he quickly recognized her natural aptitude for military strategy. During quiet periods, they would discuss base security, analyze potential threats, and review emergency response procedures. Williams had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and had seen enough combat to recognize soldiers who possessed unusual combinations of skills. Elena's medical expertise was obvious, but her tactical thinking impressed him more. She asked questions that most medics never considered. How long would it take enemy forces to reach the base from various approach routes? What would happen to medical operations if the primary generator failed during an attack? How could medical personnel continue treating patients if the base's defensive perimeter was breached? These conversations led Elena to develop detailed contingency plans for medical operations under combat conditions. She identified alternate locations within the base where emergency medical treatment could continue if the main medical facility became compromised. She studied the base's weapon systems and defensive positions, calculating how medical personnel could contribute to the base's defense if necessary. Her preparation went far beyond theoretical planning. Elena used her off-duty time to familiarize herself with every weapon system on the base. She qualified expert with the M4 rifle, M9 pistol, and M240 machine gun. More importantly, she practiced transition drills that would allow her to move quickly between medical treatment and combat operations. She developed muscle memory for reloading weapons while wearing medical gloves, for switching between medical supplies and combat equipment without looking, for treating wounded soldiers while maintaining situational awareness of potential threats. The other medical personnel began noticing Elena's unusual level of preparation, but they attributed it to the natural caution of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. Dr. Brennan occasionally joked that Elena seemed more prepared for combat than some of the infantry soldiers, not realizing how accurate that assessment actually was. Elena's medical skills remained her primary focus, but she approached combat medicine with a warrior's mindset. She studied wound ballistics not just to understand how to treat gunshot injuries, but to understand how different weapons affected human targets. She practiced emergency surgical procedures under simulated combat stress, using loud music and flashing lights to replicate the chaos of battle. Most importantly, she developed protocols for continuing medical operations even under direct enemy fire. The base's commanding officer, Major Peterson, had served with Elena during her previous deployment and specifically requested her assignment to his unit. He understood that forward operating bases in hostile territory needed medical personnel who could adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations. What he didn't fully appreciate was the extent to which Elena had prepared herself for scenarios that most military planners considered unlikely. As autumn arrived in the mountainous region, intelligence reports suggested increasing enemy activity throughout the area. Patrol units reported more frequent contact with enemy forces, and electronic surveillance detected increased radio communications in local languages. The base's security posture was elevated, but routine operations continued normally. Elena used this period of heightened alertness to refine her emergency procedures. She conducted informal training sessions with other medical personnel, focusing on treating patients under combat conditions. She inventoried medical supplies and created emergency caches throughout the base. Most importantly, she maintained her physical conditioning and combat readiness while continuing to provide excellent medical care to soldiers who needed treatment. The irony of Elena's situation was that her fellow soldiers saw her as exactly what she appeared to be, a highly competent combat medic who took her job seriously. They appreciated her medical expertise and respected her dedication to soldier welfare. None of them realized that beneath her quiet, professional exterior was someone who had spent years preparing for a type of combat that most medical personnel hoped they would never experience. Elena's transformation from healer to warrior hadn't happened overnight. It was the result of years of study, training, and psychological preparation. She had learned to compartmentalize different aspects of her personality, switching seamlessly between the compassionate caregiver who held dying soldiers' hands and the tactical thinker who calculated fields of fire and ammunition expenditure rates. The approaching crisis would test every aspect of Elena's preparation, but, for now, she continued her daily routine of treating soldiers' injuries, maintaining medical equipment, and quietly preparing for a battle that she hoped would never come. In a few weeks, enemy forces would discover that the quiet medic they had dismissed as a non-combatant was actually the most dangerous person on the base. As Elena completed her evening medical rounds and secured the clinic for the night, she performed her personal ritual of checking her combat gear and reviewing her emergency plans. Tomorrow would bring new patients to treat and new challenges to overcome, but she was ready for whatever came next. The soldiers sleeping safely in their barracks had no idea that their medic was also their most capable protector, and Elena intended to keep it that way until the moment her hidden skills became necessary for their survival. 3 weeks into November, the intelligence reports began painting a clearer picture of the threat developing around Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Elena noticed the changes before the official briefings confirmed them. Local radio chatter had increased dramatically, and the few remaining civilian workers seemed increasingly nervous. More telling were the small details that only someone with Elena's background would recognize: fresh tire tracks on previously unused mountain paths, unusual patterns in local market activity, and the complete absence of children from areas where they normally played. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived at the base on a cold Tuesday morning, bringing with him classified intelligence that would change everything. Elena was treating a soldier's infected wound when she saw the helicopter landing, noting the unusual security protocols and the grim expressions of the officers who met the aircraft. She didn't need access to classified information to understand that something significant was happening. The briefing that followed confirmed Elena's worst suspicions. Intelligence indicated that a large enemy force was assembling in the mountains surrounding their valley. Unlike previous enemy activities in the region, this appeared to be a coordinated effort involving multiple groups working together. More concerning was the intelligence suggesting that the enemy had detailed knowledge of the base's layout, defensive positions, and daily routines. Colonel Martinez addressed the assembled personnel with characteristic bluntness. The enemy force was estimated at between 200 and 300 fighters, equipped with modern weapons and apparently well-trained in assault tactics. Their objective appeared to be the complete destruction of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, both as a military target and as a symbol of American presence in the region. Elena listened to the briefing with growing concern, not just for the obvious dangers it represented, but for details that seemed to be receiving insufficient attention. The enemy's knowledge of base operations suggested either sophisticated surveillance or insider information. Their timing coincided with a period when several key personnel were away on leave, reducing the base's defensive capabilities. Most troubling was the intelligence indicating that enemy forces had specifically studied American medical facilities, suggesting they understood the importance of neutralizing medical capabilities during an assault. The base's defensive preparations began immediately. Additional ammunition was distributed, defensive positions were reinforced, and communication protocols were updated. Elena participated in these preparations while maintaining her medical responsibilities, but she also began implementing her own contingency plans. She moved critical medical supplies to alternate locations throughout the base, established emergency treatment areas away from the main medical facility, and quietly reviewed her personal combat preparations. Dr. Brennan noticed Elena's increased activity but attributed it to normal preparation for potential casualties. She didn't realize that Elena was preparing for scenarios that went far beyond treating wounded soldiers. Elena's plans included the possibility that medical personnel might need to defend their patients, that the main medical facility might be destroyed, and that normal evacuation procedures might become impossible. The first sign of enemy preparation came 3 days later when a patrol reported finding elaborate enemy observation positions in the hills overlooking the base. These weren't the crude hides typically used by local fighters, but sophisticated installations that showed evidence of careful planning and professional military knowledge. More disturbing were indications that these positions had been occupied for weeks, meaning the enemy had been studying the base's operations far longer than anyone had realized. Elena's medical duties took on additional urgency as soldiers prepared for the expected attack. Minor injuries that might normally be treated over several days needed immediate attention to ensure maximum combat readiness. She worked 18-hour days treating everything from infected cuts to stress-related ailments, but she also used these medical interactions to assess each soldier's combat capabilities and psychological readiness. Sergeant Williams approached Elena during one of her brief rest periods with a proposal that surprised even her. He had been thinking about the base's defensive weaknesses and realized that the medical facility represented both a critical asset and a vulnerable target. If enemy forces managed to penetrate the base's perimeter, the medical facility would become a prime objective, not just for its destruction but potentially for use as a stronghold. Williams suggested that Elena and the other medical personnel should be prepared to defend their patients if necessary. He offered to provide additional weapons training and to help develop defensive protocols for the medical facility. Elena accepted his offer, but she didn't reveal the extent of her existing preparation. Instead, she allowed him to believe he was training a medic who needed to learn combat skills rather than working with someone who had already mastered them. The training sessions that followed gave Elena an opportunity to assess the combat readiness of her medical colleagues. Dr. Brennan proved to be a surprisingly good shot with a pistol but was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of using weapons against human targets. The other medics showed varying levels of aptitude and comfort with weapons, but none of them approached Elena's level of proficiency. More importantly, these training sessions allowed Elena to introduce tactical concepts without revealing her extensive background in combat operations. She suggested defensive positions for the medical facility that would provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining access to patients. She recommended communication protocols that would allow medical personnel to coordinate with other defenders while continuing to provide medical care. Most significantly, she helped develop procedures for treating patients under direct enemy fire. The enemy's final preparations became obvious during the last week of November. Electronic surveillance detected a dramatic increase in radio communications, and aerial reconnaissance revealed the movement of large groups toward positions around the base. More ominous was the discovery of weapons caches and equipment stockpiles that indicated the enemy intended to sustain a prolonged assault rather than conduct a quick raid. Elena used this final preparation period to complete her own arrangements. She distributed her personal combat equipment to strategic locations throughout the base, ensuring she would have access to weapons and ammunition regardless of where she might be when the attack began. She memorized the locations of every critical system on the base, from power generation to water supplies. Most importantly, she mentally rehearsed the transition from medical care to combat operations until it became as automatic as checking a patient's pulse. The base's final defensive briefing took place on the evening of November 29. Intelligence indicated that the attack would likely come within the next 48 hours, probably during the early morning hours when defenders would be at their lowest state of alertness. The enemy's plan appeared to involve simultaneous assaults from multiple directions, with the goal of overwhelming the base's defenses and preventing effective resistance. Elena participated in this briefing as the senior medical representative, but she found herself analyzing the tactical situation with the same intensity as the combat commanders. She identified potential weaknesses in the defensive plan and mentally calculated how medical operations could continue under various attack scenarios. More importantly, she began preparing herself psychologically for the possibility that her role might expand far beyond treating wounded soldiers. The irony of Elena's situation wasn't lost on her. For months, she had been known throughout the base as the quiet medic who never caused trouble and always got the job done. Soldiers sought her out not just for medical treatment but for the calm reassurance she provided during stressful periods. Officers relied on her medical expertise and appreciated her professional competence. None of them suspected that beneath her gentle exterior was someone who had spent years preparing for exactly the type of combat they were about to face. Elena's final preparations involved both practical and psychological elements. She cleaned and inspected every piece of equipment she might need, from medical supplies to combat gear. She reviewed her emergency plans one final time, making mental notes of potential improvements and adaptations. Most importantly, she prepared herself mentally for the transition from healer to warrior, knowing that the coming battle would require her to use skills that most people hoped they would never need. The transformation that was about to take place would shock everyone who knew Elena, but it was the culmination of years of careful preparation. She had studied her enemy, prepared her equipment, trained her body, and conditioned her mind for the type of combat that was approaching. When the attack finally came, the quiet medic would reveal herself to be something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. As Elena completed her final medical rounds on the night of November 30th, she moved through the base with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her service for years. The soldiers she treated had no idea that their medic was also the person most prepared to defend them when the morning brought enemy forces streaming down from the surrounding hills. Elena intended to keep that secret until the moment when revealing her true capabilities became necessary for their survival. The storm that had been gathering for weeks was about to break, and Elena Rodriguez was ready to meet it with everything she had learned, planned, and prepared. Tomorrow would test every aspect of her training, but tonight she was still just the medic who made sure everyone received the care they needed. In a few hours, that quiet professional would become something entirely different, and the enemy forces preparing to attack forward operating base Sentinel would learn that they had seriously underestimated at least one of their targets. The attack began at 0347 hours on December 1st, exactly as Elena had predicted. She was already awake, having learned long ago to trust the subtle changes in atmosphere that preceded violence. The first indication wasn't gunfire or explosions, but the sudden silence of nightbirds that had been calling in the hills around the base. Elena was fully dressed and checking her medical supplies when the first mortar rounds began falling. The enemy's opening barrage was more sophisticated than anything the base had previously experienced. Instead of random targeting, the mortars focused on specific objectives: the communication center, the main generator, and the primary defensive positions. Elena realized immediately that this wasn't the work of local fighters but of someone with professional military training who understood how to systematically degrade a defensive position. She was moving toward the medical facility when the first penetration of the base perimeter occurred. Enemy fighters had used the mortar barrage as cover to approach the eastern fence line, cutting through the wire and establishing a foothold inside the base. Elena could see muzzle flashes from the guard towers as defenders engaged the infiltrators, but the enemy's knowledge of the base layout allowed them to move effectively even in darkness. The medical facility's emergency lighting activated as the main power grid went down, creating an eerie red glow that turned the treatment areas into something resembling a scene from hell. Elena's training kicked in automatically as she began preparing for casualties, but part of her mind was calculating tactical developments outside. The enemy wasn't just attacking randomly, they were executing a carefully planned assault designed to capture rather than destroy the base. The first wounded soldiers arrived within minutes of the initial attack. Sergeant Martinez stumbled through the medical facility doors with shrapnel wounds from a mortar fragment, followed by two privates who had been caught in the open when the barrage began. Elena treated their injuries with her usual efficiency, but she was also listening to the sound patterns of combat outside, analyzing the development of the tactical situation. Dr. Brennan was struggling to maintain her composure as explosions shook the building and gunfire echoed through the corridors. She had never experienced anything approaching this level of violence, and Elena realized she would need to manage the medical team's psychological state as well as their patients' physical injuries. She spoke calmly to Dr. Brennan while treating Martinez's wounds, explaining that the building was structurally sound and that the defensive plans were working as intended. What Elena didn't share was her growing realization that the base's defenses were being systematically overwhelmed. The enemy's knowledge of defensive positions and personnel assignments was too accurate to be the result of external surveillance alone. Someone had provided detailed intelligence about the base's operations, and that person was now helping coordinate an attack designed to achieve maximum psychological and tactical impact. The sound of gunfire was moving closer to the medical facility, indicating that enemy forces had penetrated deeper into the base than the defensive plans had anticipated. Elena made a quick decision to implement her contingency medical protocols. She directed Dr. Brennan and the other medics to move the most seriously wounded patients to the prepared alternate treatment area in the base's administrative building, while she remained in the primary facility to handle new casualties. The wisdom of Elena's preparation became apparent when enemy fighters reached the medical facility's outer perimeter. Through the reinforced windows, she could see muzzle flashes from weapons being fired at close range. The base's defenders were fighting hard, but they were being pushed back by an enemy force that seemed to anticipate every defensive move. Elena was treating a soldier's head injury when she heard the distinctive sound of shaped charges being placed against the medical facility's main entrance. The enemy intended to breach the building systematically, probably to use it as a stronghold for controlling the center of the base. Elena realized that her role was about to change dramatically, and she began her mental transition from healer to warrior. She moved quickly through the medical facility, checking on patients who couldn't be moved and gathering essential supplies. Her personal combat equipment was cached in 3 locations throughout the building, and she retrieved an M4 rifle and ammunition from the first location while maintaining her medical duties. To any observer, she still appeared to be a medic preparing for casualties, but her movements had acquired the precision of someone preparing for combat. The shaped charges detonated with a thunderous roar that shattered windows throughout the building and filled the air with smoke and debris. Elena was ready when the first enemy fighters entered through the breached doorway, moving tactically and checking corners with the precision of well-trained soldiers. They expected to find medical personnel hiding behind desks or cowering in supply closets. They didn't expect to encounter a medic who had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. Elena's first shots were fired from a concealed position behind a medical cabinet, catching the lead enemy fighter completely by surprise. Her training in transition from medical care to combat operations proved its value as she moved fluidly between treating a wounded soldier and engaging enemy targets. The psychological impact on the attacking force was immediate and dramatic. They had expected to easily overwhelm non-combatant medical personnel, not face effective resistance from someone they had dismissed as harmless. The combat that followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced in her previous deployments. Instead of the brief, intense engagements typical of patrol actions, this was sustained close-quarters fighting in confined spaces filled with medical equipment and wounded soldiers. Elena had to coordinate defensive fire with patient care, treating injuries while maintaining tactical awareness of enemy movements throughout the building. Her years of study and preparation paid dividends as she adapted to rapidly changing tactical situations. When enemy fighters attempted to use smoke grenades to mask their movement, Elena switched to thermal imaging equipment she had positioned for this contingency. When they tried to flank her position by moving through adjoining rooms, she was ready with pre-positioned claymore mines that she had quietly installed during her months of preparation. The enemy's confusion was evident in their radio communications, which Elena could monitor through equipment she had obtained through unofficial channels. They had expected to capture the medical facility within minutes, using it as a base for controlling the center of the compound. Instead, they found themselves engaged in a sustained firefight with someone who seemed to anticipate their every tactical move. Elena's most significant advantage was her intimate knowledge of the medical facility's layout combined with her understanding of enemy tactics. She had studied how attacking forces typically move through buildings, and she had prepared defensive positions that exploited common tactical mistakes. More importantly, she had trained herself to think like an attacker while fighting like a defender, allowing her to anticipate enemy moves before they developed. The tide of battle began to turn when Elena implemented the most dangerous part of her emergency plan. Using her knowledge of the base's infrastructure systems, she accessed the emergency power controls and began manipulating lighting throughout the facility. By creating patterns of light and darkness, she could channel enemy movement into predetermined kill zones while maintaining her own concealment. This psychological warfare had devastating effects on the attacking force. Soldiers who had entered the building expecting easy victory found themselves fighting an opponent who seemed to control every aspect of the environment. Elena's ability to coordinate medical treatment with tactical operations created a surreal situation where wounded enemy fighters received immediate medical care from the same person who had just been shooting at them. Dr. Brennan's voice came over the medical team's radio frequency, reporting that enemy forces were approaching the alternate treatment facility. Elena realized that the base's defensive situation was deteriorating rapidly, and that her role would need to expand beyond defending the medical facility. She began preparing for movement to support other defensive positions while maintaining medical operations for wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated. The enemy's tactical situation was becoming increasingly complicated. They had expected to achieve their objectives within the first hour of the attack, but they were now facing sustained resistance from multiple positions throughout the base. More problematic was their discovery that the intelligence they had relied on was incomplete. None of their planning had accounted for the possibility that medical personnel might offer effective combat resistance. Elena's transformation from medic to warrior was complete, but her commitment to medical care remained absolute. She continued treating wounded soldiers, both American and enemy, while coordinating defensive fire and planning tactical movements. This dual role created psychological pressure on attacking forces who found themselves receiving life-saving medical care from someone they had been trying to kill moments earlier. As dawn approached, Elena prepared for the next phase of the battle. The enemy's initial assault had failed to achieve its objectives, but she knew they would regroup and attempt a more systematic approach. Her ammunition supplies were adequate for continued resistance, and her knowledge of the base's layout would become even more valuable as fighting moved to other areas. The quiet medic who had arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel 6 months earlier no longer existed. In her place was someone who had successfully defended a critical facility against overwhelming odds while maintaining her commitment to healing the wounded. But the battle was far from over, and Elena knew that the most difficult fighting still lay ahead. Dawn brought no relief to Forward Operating Base Sentinel, only a clearer view of the devastation surrounding the medical facility. Elena counted 17 enemy bodies in and around the building she had defended through the night, but radio communications indicated that the overall battle was far from over. Enemy forces had regrouped in the hills surrounding the base and were preparing for a second assault, this time with full knowledge of the unexpected resistance they would face. Elena moved through the medical facility, checking on patients and assessing her tactical situation. 3 American soldiers had been wounded during the night fighting, but all were stable and could be moved if necessary. More concerning was her ammunition status. She had expended nearly 60% of her prepared supplies during the night engagement. Her careful pre-positioning of equipment had allowed her to resupply during the fighting, but sustained combat was revealing the limitations of individual preparation. The base's command structure had been disrupted by the initial assault. Colonel Martinez was wounded but conscious in the alternate medical facility, and Major Peterson was coordinating defensive operations from a makeshift command post in the armory building. Elena established radio contact with Peterson and provided a detailed assessment of her position and capabilities, carefully omitting any mention of her extensive tactical preparation that might raise uncomfortable questions later. Peterson's voice carried the strain of a commander facing impossible odds. Intelligence updates indicated that the enemy force was larger than initially estimated, possibly approaching 400 fighters with additional reinforcements moving down from the mountains. More troubling was reconnaissance indicating that enemy forces were equipped with heavy weapons including recoilless rifles and mortars that could systematically destroy the base's remaining defensive positions. Elena realized that her role would need to expand beyond defending the medical facility. The base's survival depended on maintaining medical capabilities while supporting the overall defensive effort. She began implementing the most ambitious part of her emergency planning, mobile medical operations that could support combat operations throughout the base while denying the enemy any fixed targets to attack. Her first priority was establishing secure communication with all American personnel throughout the base. Using medical evacuation frequencies that the enemy was unlikely to monitor, she created a coordination network that allowed isolated defenders to report casualties and request medical support. More importantly, this network provided a means for coordinating tactical information without relying on the base's compromised primary communication systems. The second enemy assault began at 0800 hours with a sustained mortar barrage that targeted the base's remaining defensive positions. Elena had anticipated this development and had already moved her most critical medical supplies to blast-resistant positions throughout the compound. When the barrage lifted and enemy infantry began their advance, she was ready to provide medical support wherever it was needed most urgently. Elena's movement through the base during active combat demonstrated the value of her years of preparation. She could navigate between buildings using routes that provided concealment from enemy observation while carrying medical supplies and maintaining radio contact with defenders throughout the compound. More importantly, she could rapidly transition between medical treatment and combat operations as tactical situations developed. Her first stop was the eastern defensive position where Sergeant Williams was coordinating the defense against the enemy's main assault. 3 soldiers had been wounded by mortar fragments, and Williams himself had taken a bullet through his left shoulder. Elena treated their injuries while analyzing the tactical situation developing around the position. The enemy's second assault was more systematic than their initial attack. Instead of trying to penetrate the base at multiple points, they were concentrating their forces against the eastern perimeter while using supporting fire to pin down defenders in other areas. Elena recognized this as standard military doctrine for reducing fortified positions, and she realized that the base's defenders were facing professionally trained soldiers rather than irregular fighters. Williams briefed Elena on the developing situation while she worked on his shoulder wound. The eastern position was critical to the base's defense, but ammunition was running low and several key defensive positions had been damaged by mortar fire. More concerning was the enemy's apparent knowledge of the base's defensive plans. They seemed to anticipate every tactical move the defenders attempted. Elena made a decision that surprised even Williams. Instead of returning to the medical facility after treating the wounded, she requested permission to remain at the eastern position as both medic and additional defender. Williams initially protested, arguing that medical personnel shouldn't be exposed to unnecessary risk, but Elena's calm explanation of her capabilities convinced him to accept her offer. What followed was combat unlike anything Elena had experienced in her previous deployments. The sustained fighting around the eastern perimeter required constant adaptation to changing tactical conditions while maintaining medical readiness for treating casualties. Elena found herself treating gunshot wounds between engaging enemy targets, coordinating ammunition resupply while monitoring patients' vital signs, and providing tactical advice based on her analysis of enemy movement patterns. The psychological impact of Elena's presence was significant for both sides of the conflict. American defenders drew confidence from knowing that medical care was immediately available, allowing them to take tactical risks they might otherwise avoid. Enemy forces, meanwhile, were discovering that their intelligence about the base's capabilities had been seriously incomplete. The presence of highly effective resistance from unexpected sources was undermining their tactical planning and unit cohesion. Elena's most significant contribution to the defense came when she identified a weakness in the enemy's assault tactics. Their coordinated attacks relied on precise timing between supporting fire and infantry movement, but Elena noticed that their communication patterns had consistent intervals that could be exploited. She suggested a counterattack timing that caught enemy forces during their communication transitions, allowing the eastern position's defenders to break up several assault attempts. The fighting continued throughout the morning as enemy forces attempted to overwhelm the eastern position through sheer persistence. Elena's medical duties expanded to include treating enemy wounded who were brought into the defensive perimeter, creating the surreal situation of providing life-saving care to soldiers who had been trying to kill her minutes earlier. This approach to combat medical care demonstrated Elena's commitment to her medical oath while providing valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. By midday, the tactical situation had stabilized somewhat. Enemy forces had failed to achieve breakthrough at any point around the base's perimeter, and their casualties were mounting from sustained defensive fire. Elena's ammunition supply was nearly exhausted, but her careful rationing and tactical discipline had allowed her to maintain effective fire throughout the morning engagement while continuing to provide medical care to wounded defenders. The arrival of close air support at 1,330 hours marked the beginning of the end for the enemy assault. F-16 aircraft responding to the base's emergency calls began systematic attacks on enemy positions in the surrounding hills, forcing the attacking forces to abandon their coordinated assault tactics and seek individual survival. Elena coordinated medical care for defenders while monitoring the airstrike's effectiveness against enemy positions. As enemy resistance collapsed and surviving attackers fled into the mountains, Elena began the grim task of casualty assessment and medical triage. The base had survived the assault, but at significant cost in personnel and equipment. Her informal count suggested that she had been directly responsible for engaging 45 enemy fighters during the two-day battle, but her primary focus remained on treating American casualties and ensuring the medical facility could resume normal operations. The official after-action reports would note Elena's exceptional performance during the battle, but they would never fully capture the complexity of her contribution to the base's survival. Her years of preparation had allowed her to serve simultaneously as medic, defender, tactical advisor, and intelligence analyst while never abandoning her commitment to treating wounded soldiers regardless of their nationality. Elena's transformation during the battle had been complete but temporary. As the immediate crisis passed, she resumed her role as the quiet, professional medic who provided excellent medical care and never sought attention for her achievements. The soldiers she had fought alongside understood that something extraordinary had occurred, but Elena's preference for returning to normal operations meant that many details of her performance would remain known only to those who had witnessed them directly. The base commander's recommendation for Elena's Medal of Honor citation noted her exceptional courage and effectiveness during sustained combat operations, but it couldn't adequately describe the psychological impact of discovering that their gentle medic was also their most formidable defender. Elena had proven that the traditional distinction between combatants and medical personnel was less absolute than military doctrine suggested, and that proper preparation could allow one person to fulfill multiple critical roles during crisis situations. Elena Rodriguez returned to her normal duties as senior medic at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, treating routine injuries and maintaining medical equipment with the same quiet competence she had always displayed. The only visible change was a slight increase in the respect she received from soldiers throughout the base, and the unofficial understanding that their medic was someone who could be counted on for anything the situation might require. The enemy forces who survived the assault would carry with them stories of the American medic who had killed dozens of their comrades while simultaneously providing medical care to wounded fighters from both sides. These stories would grow in the telling, creating a legend that Elena herself would never acknowledge but that would serve as a deterrent to future attacks on American medical facilities in the region. For Elena, the battle represented validation of years of preparation and training, but it also reinforced her commitment to the medical profession that remained her primary calling. She had proven that a healer could also be a warrior when circumstances required, but she preferred to remain known as the medic who never failed to provide excellent care to anyone who needed it, regardless of the circumstances surrounding their injury.